Hello, my name is Christina Herrin, Government Relations Manager of Health Policy at the Heartland Institute. And today, my special guest is Jonathan Emord, constitutional lawyer and health freedom advocate. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here to talk with us today.
You're quite welcome. Glad to be here.
So you have a large background. Could you give our audience a little bit more information about what you do and your specialty?
Well, I'm an attorney and I practice constitutional and administrative law before the federal courts and agencies. I have been practicing constitutional law for 36 years. I've defeated the Food and Drug Administration 8 times in federal court, which is a record for the nation, and I'm proud of that. But I'm also the author of 5 books. The most recent is called The Authoritarians, Their Assault on Individual Liberty, the Constitution, and Free Enterprise from the 19th Century to the Present. And I write regularly for USA Today Magazine and for PJ Media. And other than that, I enjoy suing the government.
Yeah, well, we love anybody that's willing to put their voice out there to hold the government accountable. So that's great. So there's a lot that's going on in regard to COVID and healthcare and FDA approvals. So just to start, do you have any thoughts of the recent approval of the Pfizer vaccine? I think it's Comirnaty, or it's a combination of community and COVID. I don't know, mRNA, but they've created this name for it. But do you have any thoughts about that approval and that kind of very quick process to get that approved?
Yeah, I think that the vaccine, despite the enormous number of adverse event reports that have been received by the FDA, has been given a political push to approve it without really adequate evidence of its long-term safety. One of the problems with spike proteins is that they seem to adhere to any part of the body where ACE2 receptors are present. Males have more ACE2 receptors typically than females, and those who are immune compromised tend to have more ACE2 receptors than those who are not, which means that they're more vulnerable to ACE2 receptors. And that's true whether it comes from the virus or whether it comes from the vaccine. We know there is vaccine shedding, where there have been several reports of people who are immune compromised becoming very, very ill when they are near people who have received the vaccine. And we also know of a number of adverse events associated just simply with the vaccine, particularly in young people and people who are immune compromised. So I think there needs to be more precaution, and particularly there's no reservation for vaccinating people who've already been already had the disease. So people who've already had the disease quite frequently have high T cell counts, and they also have antibody production. That appears to be of long duration, perhaps even your entire life. And when you add to their immune system a new load of spike proteins in the form of a vaccine after they have recovered from COVID, you may be creating, and we see in some instances, individuals are suffering severe adverse effects that may be life-threatening. So why they don't exempt individuals from the vaccine mandates who already have had COVID, which roughly natural immunity seems to be present in about 50%. If you take the entire population of those who've been vaccinated, roughly 50% of those, that number is the number of people who have likely had COVID and recovered. Something like 110 million people in the United States. And they have full immunity, and the scientific evidence does not support the conclusion that those who have natural immunity are enhanced in any respect with regard to immunity when they receive the vaccine. There's no benefit of the vaccine for those who are naturally immune. moreover, when you look at the whole population, while there's overlap between those who naturally recovered from the disease and those who have been vaccinated, it's not complete by any means. And as a result, the estimate given to the public of 50%, 52% vaccination fails to undercounts the presence of those who have immunity. If we take into account those who have immunity, we may well be in the 70% to 80% category already. We already see the incidence of original infection diminishing. And so, so this whole government approach of pushing vaccination is very troubling. They should be pushing information, as much information, good and bad, as about the vaccine, allowing individuals to exercise their own choice and respecting that choice. That's what freedom's all about. This country wasn't built upon the notion that if there is a virus present, our Bill of Rights should be suspended.
Well, I'm just going to follow into our next question here. So I want to talk a little bit about mandating the vaccine. That was something that was that's been discussed by several political leaders in certain states, and local government bodies have kind of talked about this. And now I know even in the military that was a discussion, and Representative Thomas Massie put out legislation to try to ban the ability for the government to mandate our military forces to vaccinate. And so I'm just wondering now, with the legality issue of all of this, do you think now it will be easier, for state governments or any bodies to mandate this vaccine under, a more legal framework? I know there have been court cases in the past with smallpox and things like that kind of set a precedent that maybe that they can mandate it, especially if it's FDA approved and it has kind of gotten that gold stamp of FDA approval. What are your thoughts on this vaccine being added to this laundry list of mandated vaccines, even though it's just been around for such a short period of time?
Right. I think that as a policy matter, it's a terrible mistake to mandate vaccination. And as a medical matter, I think it's a terrible mistake. And the reason why I say that is that one way or another, we're all going to have to accept into the human biome this virus, as we have with every other virus. So while it's a dreadful thing, and while we have suffered enormously, the number of deaths are unconscionable, and while I think China is responsible for it through the Wuhan lab, and I believe this was a effort to develop a bioweapon, I think that the exit of it from the lab was a mistake on their part. That is, they didn't intend that to happen that way. But I think all the evidence points to their intentional use of it when they shut down transportation domestically, but intentionally left it open internationally from Wuhan so that the virus would spread through the world. And then they weren't quiet about their desire to see the United States drown in a sea of coronavirus. So I think it's rather clear that this was weaponized by the Chinese and introduced into the world. Having said that, this is now a virus we have to deal with. We're going to have to come to grips with this one way or another. So altering our freedom fundamentally by denying people or creating a class of people who will be deprived of their liberty is not the answer. The answer is really manning up to the reality that this is going to go through the population. And one way or another, we're going to have to cope with it. Giving people full information, allowing them to choose to be vaccinated or not, and not lying to them as the CDC has about natural immunity, but telling them the truth, that if they've had the virus, they have natural immunity and they need not be vaccinated. And if they are vaccinated, they're likely at a higher risk of adverse events if they've already had the virus. So those truths need to be communicated. As a legal matter, it is easier for the government to argue for compelling vaccination of a FDA-approved vaccine than it is an experimental vaccine, because the government, by the FDA's own regulations, cannot compel a person to take an experimental vaccine. Having said that, when governors the president or mayors act unilaterally to compel vaccination, they violate in almost every instance the separation of powers, because these are broad legislative actions. They're not in nature executive actions. They're not simply implementing existing law. They really are creating new legal regimes to force people to be vaccinated by denying them employment opportunities and so forth through either direct action or coercion. So this is unlike any other instance in our history in which the government has acted to recommend or insist on vaccination in the education context. When you embrace the entire society and limit your ability to go to a grocery store, go to stay at a hotel, fly, have your right of transportation, your right of movement restricted. All of these things are extreme changes in the law that must, at a minimum, require legislative action in the way in which laws are traditionally passed. Having said that, even if you were to pass legislation, it raises, at a minimum, an equal protection argument under the 14th Amendment, or if it's a federal action under the 5th Amendment, in that there are profound problems at the most basic level, rational basis review, which would be applied likely in this instance. Even at that level, there are problems because they are imposing these mandates in a blanket manner without regard to the particular medical circumstances of each person. That is a serious medical mistake, and it causes individuals who are, as I mentioned, already at natural immunity, or who otherwise are at risk of adverse effects that are severe, to be forced into being vaccinated. It also violates religious liberty. There are many in our country, individuals who have religious scruples that are against this. They believe that this is inappropriate to vaccinate their children with it, or themselves or others. And so they can stand on their freedom of religion, and that can be used as a cudgel to bat against these mandates. And there's no provision, for example, in New York, to take into account religious liberty as a method to dissent from being forcibly injected with a drug.
Right. Well, that kind of brings me to follows into my next question, but I just think it's so interesting that, it's sad. It's not interesting. It's horribly sad that there are nurses and these medical professionals that are testifying. I just saw one a few days ago, a nurse who spoke out in the state of Michigan during, a legislative hearing. And, her employer is trying to force her out if she doesn't get vaccinated. We're seeing it with athletes. And there's a lot of fields where I think this is going to become more prevalent, and probably, more lawsuits and things like that. But also, I kind of want to get into the discussion of vaccine passports and what that's leading to, because like you mentioned, the state of New York has the Elixir Pass, and there's some other states. I know Hawaii has a kind of a travel compass or something. And California and Oregon have some type of, Oregon's isn't exactly digital, but they have some requirements. And there's just a lot of, these ideas that I think people are accepting, or some people are accepting. And really, it's just shocking. And I think about HIPAA and patient privacy and how important that is. And it's just, do you have any thoughts about also the legal, matters in terms of vaccination passports and what that means, having to show your vaccine status? Or I also think of my dad, who had cancer, got diagnosed with cancer a year and a half ago, right in the midst of COVID, which was horrible. And I think of him and a lot of, people he was going through treatment with probably couldn't have gotten the vaccine if it was available because of their, medical condition. Cancer, you can't get a vaccine. A lot of people can't when they have cancer and going through treatments. So I just wonder, like you said, marginalizing these groups of people, but then also forcing them to show proof to go into a restaurant or to go to a store to get groceries. I mean, that just seems to me, that is the largest, infringement on civil liberties I've been alive for, probably.
Yeah. You're making someone disclose their medical history, at least to the extent of saying whether they've been vaccinated or not. So it invades their right of privacy, and that's another basis to attack this. It also, in the context you're talking about where a nurse is terminated or others are terminated, there are wrongful discharge type of actions and actions with regard to under the EEOC and the Americans with Disabilities Act that are possible because in certain instances. So, for example, in the instance where someone would be at substantial risk of an adverse effect, or whether they have a disability of one kind or another that affects their immune system, and they are nonetheless being fired because they're not getting a vaccine, that raises profound discrimination questions under existing law that can be brought and waged against the employer. Compelling someone to reveal their medical history as a basis to get on an airplane or to go into a shop of one kind or another is a invasion of privacy. If it's a private company doing it without a government mandate, it raises different issues, but some of which may be contractual in nature, depending on the relationship between the customer and the company. But when the government does it, very profoundly violates someone's right of privacy, their right of medical privacy. And it also creates a situation where it casts a stigma upon those who are not card-carrying vaccinated people and distinguishes them for discriminatory treatment. So there are other questions that arise when a business decides to disallow people to purchase its goods or services based on their status. While it's not an immutable characteristic, it again may be a violation of either federal or state law affecting commerce and the way in which you can deny services. Yeah, there are a lot of issues here.
Yeah, I think also too, coming from like a free market perspective and a liberty-minded or libertarian or constitutional conservative, whatever you want to call me or the Heartland Institute, but free thinkers, and I think a free market perspective, I think it's really difficult. We obviously would support, or I would support a baker being able to bake, the cake for who they want to in Colorado, but it's just odd to me that now we're marginalizing a vaccination status, but we have lots of laws in place that are anti-discriminatory, and just odd to me the certain political avenues that people take for certain categorizations of people, but then other categorizations of people, they're fine to let these companies discriminate against them. So I want freedom for everyone, of course, and obviously, like you mentioned, the government implementing these vaccine passports or this regulation versus a private business is very different, but it's just difficult when it feels like it's coming down from the federal government onto a lot of these businesses, and there's kind of this stigma around it now. If you don't want to get vaccinated for every reason, it's just very invasive and it's very, very strange. I've never seen anything like it, of people wanting to know this information about everyone.
It's also irrational. It's an irrational scheme. And the reason why it's irrational is that there are all manner of communicable diseases, many of which are very serious and life-threatening, not least of which is tuberculosis. And there's no requirement of a medical check. So it's under inclusive in the sense that all manner of immigrants coming into this country, for example, who are not documented, are variously at risk of having various diseases that come from various parts of the world, for which there's a great high risk of death for people in this country, and yet there's no measure being taken whatsoever to restrict their access. And when you could produce your card, right? And you could also have tuberculosis. You could produce your card and also have Ebola. You could produce your card and have any other highly contagious, lethal disease, and you'd be allowed entry. But someone who was perfectly healthy, who didn't have a card, but who was nevertheless free of disease, would be blocked. So it's both under-inclusive and over-inclusive. And the reason why it doesn't work, why it's just ridiculous in the end, is that it's not going to do anything to the overall risk of contagion in the country. Right. It is going to impair people's rights, and it's going to take a large number of people, in fact, the overwhelming majority, who are not sick, and treat them as if they are spreading a contagious disease. And it's that stigma of, oh, you are potentially carrying a contagious disease because you don't have this card.
Right.
And likewise, oh, you have this card. Oh, you're completely free of any risk to me. Well,
Right.
both of those assumptions are absolutely absurd. So it's
Exactly.
irrational in the extreme, illogical, and it's the kind of dumb Marxist thinking that leads to uniform rules and authoritarian control over populations worldwide. We, as a people, have to reject it. We have to reject it because it violates the very definition of who we are, stemming from the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We must be a free people, and we have to use our brains to deal with this virus, not violate civil liberties. I mean, you can take anyone, everybody is at risk of something. You might get, unfortunately hit by a vehicle, or a vehicle might hit your vehicle, or, any number of, you'd be hit by an asteroid or lightning bolt or anything. But we don't compel people at birth to be enclosed in a bomb-proof cylinder that with external oxygen to ensure that they don't get any virus and that they're not subjected to any injury as best we possibly can do it, and mandate that. Why should we treat this any differently? Sure, it's a contagion, but it's going to go. It's going to go away. Our deprivation of liberties will be here for a very long time. We need to cope with this. It's going to leave us. And the reason why it's going to leave us is that it's going to be degraded. The history of the coronavirus is that after its initial appearance in the first year or so, each year thereafter, it becomes far less virulent. So it ends up becoming something that we all experience, unfortunately, but it becomes less virulent. There are far fewer deaths. So when the next summer rolls around, this thing is going to be substantially degraded. And when it continues year after year, it's going to just meld into the overall background of diseases we face as a people. So sooner or later, we're all going to get it. And as you see with the variant, the Delta variant, which has been grossly exaggerated by the government, the Delta variant is infecting those who are vaccinated, apparently by a significant percentage of those being vaccinated, such that it poses a risk to them. All right, what is the risk? Let's put it into perspective. The risk is that you'll get this disease. The overwhelming majority of those who get it have mild symptoms if they're vaccinated.
Right.
And so, and while there is an uptick in hospitalizations that are present, it is not a permanent uptick, and it certainly doesn't come to the level that we experienced in December of this year. And not only that, the symptoms are much milder, and the number of deaths are far, far lower. So the government's using this to create this hysteria over something that we can, as with every disease that we experience, and there are many new ones that are introduced every year or identified every year, we have a remarkable ability to cope with them with our own immune systems. And sure, it's sad when people have compromised immune systems, the elderly and so forth. Those are the ones we should be using exceptional care. But for the rest of us, we have to get used to the idea that, hey, look, we've been through a lot in our lives with disease. We're going to experience more disease. China isn't going away. They found a way to really take down the Western economy. They're probably going to do some more of this mischief. We have got to cope with this without taking away our freedoms.
Right. Yeah, I think one issue is the groupthink that you mentioned. It's just constant, and it's in every single facet of a policy issue. And I think the problem with the coronavirus is it's all encompassing. I mean, they put forbearance on student loans, I think, until the end of the year. They've continued the moratorium on, rents and things like that. And they've, there's protests or people that are not a protest, but people that have signed, almost 30,000 people that have signed for another stimulus check. And I think that this kind of issue where there's, one job per unemployed person because people don't want to go back to work because it's better not to. And they have this great excuse from the government. It's just one step closer for the government getting to this, kind of communist or socialist or universal everything, power. And I really think that this is the vessel in which the government is using to get that power. And I just think it's very unfortunate that you don't have independent thinkers and people just that are running to, the mass view. And if they want to get vaccinated, that's fine. But forcing that view upon others just is very strange to me. And I don't remember who said it, but there was a quote. Basically, it said that if an idea is good enough, it shouldn't, require force. And I think that's so important. And we should really focus on educating people, and the government should focus on educating people if they want people to get vaccinated. But yeah, it's just a shocking time. But I also want to talk about something, the Trinity Health Freedom Expo that'll be happening in October in Chicago. Can you talk a little bit about that and your involvement there, what you'll be doing?
Yeah, on October 1st and 2nd in Tinley Park, Illinois, the Health Freedom Expo is going to be held, and this is held every year. It's sponsored by the Trinity Health Group that has been putting it on since, well, I think three decades ago. And it's a remarkable event because it brings together what you're talking about, which is information that people don't get anywhere else, particularly health information that they just won't get anywhere else. Now, it also talks about your civil liberties as they relate to health freedom. And I've spoken at the expo probably 15, 16 times. I'm going to be there again this year speaking. I'll be signing my new book there. So anyway, and there'll be many others who will be there speaking, who are experts in different areas, who are giving you information that you just won't get anywhere else about new therapeutics, new methods of dealing with these difficult diseases, and also just about how to improve your overall health, your immune system, and so forth. And all this information is suppressed, as you know, by big tech and by the government, and people are threatened right and left when they try to sell something or introduce any innovation whatsoever. On that point of innovation, you don't hear anything from the government about the therapeutics. You don't hear, and there's no great emphasis in policy on therapeutics at all. And it's solely on vaccine. And the reason why it's solely on vaccine, in part, is because they can control you better through the vaccination route. If they can compel an entire population to be vaccinated and to control those people and to gather as much information about those people and to basically cause panic throughout the population such that people won't go to work and to bribe them to stay at home through extended welfare benefits. You're right. They achieved that socialist state that they so desperately want. Right. This administration is a socialist administration. Joe Biden really has sold his soul, did so before the election, to the socialists. He has no principles. This man has absolutely no core beliefs whatsoever. He's willing to sell himself to anyone who, in order to gain political power. That is perhaps most transparently apparent in this withdrawal from Afghanistan, where he's willing to sacrifice American lives and pull the American military out. What a gross example of not only massive incompetence, but also his absence of any sense of national pride. No nationalism in him at all. He doesn't care that it's Americans he's leaving behind. He doesn't care that he first removed the military without getting the American civilians out. He doesn't care about those things because he simply does not believe in this country. He is not a person who believes in the Constitution. He can't even understand it. And so this type of thinking, or absence of it, is what's driving this idea that we're going to take everybody's rights away. We're going to tell them how to live. It's Rahm Emanuel who said, don't let a crisis go to waste. That's exactly what's happening here on the federal level. They look forward to this whole crisis as a way to gain much more control over the economy, over individuals' freedom of choice, to deny them that, and to direct their lives. And so it's not, we've got to wake up to the reality that when you part with your freedom and you fall in lockstep to the dictates of the federal government, you are very, very, very near the end of your experiment in individual liberty and protection for it, and individuals being sovereigns and the state being their servants. You flipped it, and now you are but a slave to the state, and that's the authoritarian dream, and that's what they're seeing achieved right now. We have to wake up, following Lincoln's recommendation, we have to hearken to the better angels of our nature, yes, but we also have to remind ourselves of those mystic cords that tie us to the Declaration, to the principles that are articulated in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, which define what it is to be an American. If we do that, we will reject these things. We will reject these things and do it courageously, and we will not allow ourselves and to enslave ourselves, but not also our children, to a state that is not only woefully in debt, but is also woefully in control of every aspect of our lives.
Right. Well, on that note, I have to ask, do you have any other final thoughts for our audience regarding healthcare or FDA or COVID or government, control and overreaching, federal government? Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, people need to understand our history. They need to appreciate that socialism is not something new in America. It has lurked within the administrative states since really the 1860s forward. Actually, in the first administrative agency in 1886, the Interstate Commerce Commission, this was driven by socialist concepts, the idea that you should circumvent the Constitution and its limits on power to combine legislative, executive, and judicial powers in single hands and create a dictatorial regime that would run roughshod over individual rights for the purpose of achieving this quote-unquote common good. This Hegelian notion of the state defining through experts what is in our best interest rather than allowing us to define what's in our own best interests ourselves. And so that is the history that I relate in the authoritarians. And it's quite shocking, but true, that, in the antebellum South, the slave-owning generation that looked at the abolitionist demand for the elimination of slavery and didn't know what to do with it because it caused them to suffer a conflict between their forebears fighting for the revolution and against British tyranny and for the Declaration principles, and this notion that you could enslave others, both blacks and whites, by the way, as I explain in the authoritarians, one of the parts of American history being denied by this nonsense from BLM and the 1619 Project is that slavery was not just a black phenomenon in America. Right. Whites were enslaved, Irish were enslaved, English were enslaved. And while by the time of the 1860, there were overwhelming numbers of blacks enslaved by comparison to whites, there were still white slaves. And even indeed in Louisiana, the number of blacks who were slave owners was quite extraordinary. And the wealthiest black slave owner in Louisiana in 1860 was himself black. So there were both black slave owners of whites, and there were whites who were enslaved. So this is not, no one has any claim to this based on their pigment. This is a history that affects us all. It's a horrible history. We got rid of slavery, but we got rid of it without getting rid of the doctrine that supported it. And that progressive doctrine is what all of the leading progressives in this country and socialists in this country, the two are intertwined inextricably, believe in. And if we believe in American principles, if we believe in the principles that our founding fathers believed in, we will not accept for a minute the idea that we should accept socialism, whether it comes through a needle with a vaccine or whether it comes through a socialist welfare program or whether it comes through any other seizure of power in the midst of a crisis.
Right. Well, it's definitely coming in different forms, which is, the hardest battle is there's different, types of socialism that we have to fight. But I appreciate your time. And is there a way for our audience to stay up to date with any of the new works that you're coming out with and what you're doing?
Yes. So they can acquire the authoritarians through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, Walmart. And they can also follow me through PJ Media and through USA Today Magazine and through my website at emord.com.
Great. Well, I really appreciate your time. And thank you so much for talking with me today.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure to be with you.